So we've invited Franco Bianchini to make a keynote speech, and in a way it's I think as long as I organize something like this, like conferences or whatever, if there's one person I'd always like to invite, no matter what it's about, it would actually be Franco. So, and I even start to write the titles of his talks. So when he met me at the airport, he said, "I'm not going to talk about that. Why'd you write that?" And I said, "Well, that's the last thing you said when you were in Gothenburg, and you also made a talk." And he said, "Yes, but I don't think it's fitting. I don't think that's what I'm going to talk about." And I said, "Okay, change it." But I can see he hasn't changed the title. But don't let it fool you. He's not going to talk about that at all. So I'm not quite sure what he's going to do, but I'm sure it's going to be very well thought through and very relevant. So thank you for coming, Franco, and look forward to hearing you again. Thanks.
Thank you, Trevor, for the invitation. Also for giving this opportunity to catch up with the debate on cultural planning, in which I've been involved since really cultural planning was exported from the US to Europe in the late 1980s. I think the first time I heard this term was in 1988 at a conference in Glasgow. And also, thank you for writing the title of the talk. And obviously, activism is a political concept. So I have decided, therefore, to focus most of this talk about issues of politics and the political crisis, and how cultural activists can respond to the current political crisis, which is a political crisis. We've always had a political crisis, of course, in Europe all the time, but this is a different one. It's a different one from any other political crisis that we've had before. In a sense, it's more difficult and more difficult to understand. And also, I'm happy to talk about politics, partly because I have studied so-called political science as both for my first degree and my PhD. So it's sort of useful occasionally to talk about politics. The crisis is a crisis in terms of political culture, political values. It's very clear there are big generational differences, as revealed by the analysis of the voting for the referendum in the UK in June 2016, the Brexit referendum, with the young people voting much more in favor of staying in the EU than older generations, particularly the over 50s, although, unfortunately, young people didn't vote in sufficiently large numbers, and this is why we ended up with the result that we got. The fact that they held the referendum the same weekend as the Glastonbury Festival didn't help, where there were about 300,000 young people at the festival. The vote revealed also new conflicts, urban-rural, big city, smaller town, smaller city. I call it metropolitan provincial, and center periphery. It also revealed that there was one component of the vote, but only one component for the referendum, and also for the vote for Trump in the US, is clearly also a reflection of economic insecurity. Economic insecurity, which is portrayed by concepts like the concept of the precariat, used by the British sociologist Guy Standing to refer not only to unemployed or underemployed young people, a very big problem in countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and other countries, but also older people who have lost their jobs or who have been made redundant or who are struggling to make ends meet. So the precariat is a very interesting concept, and new, often described as dangerous political class in Europe. And then the collective intelligence of the web. My friend Jeff Mulgan, now chief executive of Nesta in the UK, talks about the collective intelligence of the web, but also the collective stupidity of the web is an important theme explaining what happens. It's a recent book by Alain Deneau. He talks about mediocracy as the government of the mediocre. And I think if we look at the two countries that I know best in Europe, so Italy and the UK, I have to say that probably it is true that we have a uniquely mediocre political class that is probably unable to rise to the challenge of creating a new synthesis between these different interests that are emerging, that are at the center of the political crisis today. We also have a crisis that is a multiple crisis of trust, rationality clearly, the rationality of the 1990s when we thought that after the fall of the Berlin Wall there was going to be capitalism triumphant, the internet, the creation of the euro, the expansion of membership of the EU. That crisis of rationality is now evident. That rationality seems to have finished, and voting is informed by much more irrational forces, gut feelings that we don't fully understand. The word visceral is often used by commentators to explain these voting patterns in Europe and North America. Crisis of morality as well. Crisis of empathy, I would say, is pretty clear as well. And a crisis of hope, certainly, as revealed by the voting in different elections and in the UK referendum. And there are also crises of legitimacy of experts. Michael Gove in the UK referendum campaign saying the immortal phrase, "This country has had enough of experts," despite, in fact, being in some ways perhaps an expert himself. A crisis of legitimacy not only of politicians and experts of academia, but also of cultural institutions themselves. Hence the new interest in participation as a concept, participation as a way of legitimizing again cultural institutions. Nevertheless, we have facts that of deep, long-term social and cultural exclusion, multiple deprivation in cities like the city where I live, Hull in Yorkshire, in England, suffering from environmental, social, cultural, educational deprivation, which leads to long-term cultural exclusion. Many citizens suffer from this. We also have a phenomenon of that Giuliano da Empoli, who was in charge of culture for the city of Florence a few years ago, has described as Brazilianization of Europe. So this twin experiencing of fear, growing problem of fear, at the same time as hedonism. The two often going together, as they have in many previous historical periods. Amy Chua, in the book Political Tribes, tries to explain the crisis as a return of tribalism, that essentially a big misunderstanding of, by politicians in recent years has been the underestimating of tribal allegiances, hence mistakes in Iraq and in other countries. Also, she uses the concept of tribalism to explain the victory of Trump in the elections of 2016 in the US. Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris, on the basis of a fairly large empirical study, discovered that, interestingly, the cultural backlash is even more important than socioeconomic inequality factors as an explanation for the Brexit referendum and for the Trump victory. Similar conclusions are reached by David Goodhart in a highly contentious book called The Road to Somewhere, where he distinguishes between the somewheres, people who are highly local, highly rooted, often suffering from socioeconomic deprivation or worried about their economic stability, and the anywheres, which is perhaps more people like us, ruthless cosmopolitans, who are increasingly engaged, in a sense, in a culture war with the somewheres. So there is an issue, clearly, of the fact that we are increasingly targets. We cannot duck this one anymore. We are probably increasingly suffering from hostility by the popular press, for instance, in the UK. which is a constant force for division and malevolence in the country. I'm talking of newspapers like The Sun, The Daily Express, The Daily Mail, for instance. There is hostility to artists, intellectuals, journalists, even independent research organizations, including statistical organizations in different European countries that are trying to present facts that might not fit with the new populist simplifications that are increasingly popular across Europe. In fact, part of the hostility to the European Union can also be understood as an hostility to technocracy, what is seen as unnecessary complexity, remoteness, denial of national sovereignty. In fact, in different European languages, there is now a new political term to describe the anti-establishment forces that are rising, anti-establishment in inverted commas, of course, forces that are rising in Europe. The term is sovranista, for example, in Italian, sovereignist. Sovereignist is a new kind of political ideology. The three ends, nationalism, nativism, nostalgia, are important, and nostalgia probably for a past that maybe never existed. Faith, flag, and family, in the words of the former economic minister of Berlusconi, Tremonti, who talked about faith, flag, and family in a book that I don't advise you to read, by the way, but nevertheless, Berlusconi himself, in fact, who has miraculously now resurrected as a politician by doing well, surprisingly, in the elections of the 4th of March in Italy, and tensions between all the new migrants, all the new immigrants. For instance, the surprisingly high vote for Brexit among African Caribbean and working class African Caribbean and some lower middle class African Caribbean and Asian voters in parts of the UK, partly motivated by worry about the arrival of East European immigrants into the country after 2004. We have also, despite the Me Too movement, we also have a serious problem in some countries of a new macho politics, and it's an open question whether feminism is winning or not. Some people say yes. Other authors like Beatrix Campbell, in a book called The End of Equality, say the opposite. They say that the geopolitical rise in importance of countries like China, India, and possibly in political terms, in terms of strategic influence, Russia, means that there is actually there is increasingly a problem of growing inequality in relation to women. Certainly, the ditching of political etiquette in many countries, impatience for social inclusiveness, yearning for authoritarian leaders like Orban, Erdogan, Putin himself, with their cultural policy of self-celebration, including the building of large football stadia in very small towns, in the case of Orban in Hungary, for example. And this new vocabulary of the people is the source for political legitimacy. This is very evident in the case of the Brexit debate in the UK. The only reason for exiting the EU is because it is the will of the people. There is no other reason. It's just because the people voted for it. Of course, it's probably a good enough reason, but it's very interesting how now this reference to the people is now this source for political legitimacy. Maybe you would say it should always have been. It's, after all, the basis of democracy. Authors like Paul Stocker, in an interesting book published recently, say that there has been really a worrying mainstreaming of the political rhetoric, not even of the moderate right, of the far right, since the early 2000s. This has been evident in the language of elections in the UK. For instance, even the 2005 election, with the campaign against immigrants led by the Conservative Party, the winking, "Are you thinking what we are thinking?" slogan used by the Conservative Party, which was a reference clearly with there being too many immigrants in the country, according to them. And if we analyze the language of these new right-wing populist movements, we find keywords like protection, defense, a wound you know, almost the pride, the national pride being wounded, betrayal often used. Betrayal also used in relation to the UK referendum, very often in relation to Remainers, who are often accused of betraying the country. Organic national identity, cleaning up the country, or Italians first, the slogan used by Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Lega in the Italian elections of the 4th of March. Civilization of death, used in Poland to describe the Western civilization that favors, for instance, abortion. A new shamelessness of fascism, fascism emerging again, I'm tempted to say, from the sewers into the mainstream. Recent aggressions in Italy, for instance, a meeting of a multicultural group in Padua recently being interrupted by a group of fascists who openly read a very threatening letter saying that certain actions should not happen in the country, or people having stickers attached to their front doors saying, "Here lives an anti-fascist," something that you might regard as a compliment, but it was actually a form of intimidation recently during the Italian election campaign. So this attacks on immigrants, this ethno-nationalism that leads to that, obviously Islamophobia as an integral part of this project, enemies within being identified. There are various enemies. There can be young people sometimes in the riots in the UK in 2011, Roma communities in other cases, and us also. We are the enemy, as I said earlier. People who don't get up early enough in the morning. We were chastised, for instance, by the president of the Italian Confederation for Industry, who said that we are not part of Italy that wakes up early in the morning. We have to explain, though, that we go to bed later as well. We are not necessarily people who sleep longer than others. So this contrasting of internal enemies with virtuous citizens is something happening in different countries. And if we look at activism, cultural activist responses to political crisis, obviously the political crises are different from this one. As I said, I've never seen a political crisis like this one. I wasn't around in the 1930s, that's why. So I haven't actually experienced anything like this. But I think if we go back in history, let's say from the late 1960s, we can see that there are different cultural activist approaches to responding to different kinds of crises. For instance, in the late 60s, there was a neo-Marxist ideology very much emphasizing the importance of raising awareness and also working on the problem of false consciousness. Many citizens were seen as victims of what some critics called false universalization, which is essentially a process where the ruling class manipulates people and makes them believe that the interests of the ruling class coincide with the interests of the working class, of ordinary people. And the job of cultural activists, like many community artists in Britain, or people working in the social cultural animation movement in France, for instance, was to wake people up to through cultural work, through participation in arts activities, was to make them realize that they were being had, they were being manipulated, and therefore to break their false state of false consciousness. Then, of course, in the late 70s, when all those highly political, highly politicized revolutionary movements realized that they probably failed, there was a different kind of approach, much more ironic, much more postmodern, but nevertheless interesting, trying to encourage social interaction and mixing, often by mixing also different cultural forms. This was, for instance, all the movements encouraged by punk, post-punk in Italy, also after a very interesting social movement called the Movement of 1977. And in a way, people of my generation, I was born in 1959, are more or less the children of that movement, 1977, more than we are the children of 1968, for instance. And then in the early 80s, moving to the UK, I discovered this idea of politics of representation. There were activists, cultural activists in London, for instance, very financed often by the Greater London Council, who had been influenced by Benjamin and also by another German theorist, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, and they believed that the key thing was to give people the cultural means to produce autonomous representations of themselves. So therefore they would encourage people to actually make films, photographs, write stories, organize exhibitions, to produce autonomous representations which were different from the often negative representations produced of marginalized social groups by the media, by the mainstream media. And this was the cultural basis of strategies like the cultural industries strategy produced by the Greater London Council in the early 1980s, which very interestingly was not primarily motivated by economic development, by jobs and wealth creation, but was primarily political. If you read the documents, it was essentially about producing representations, for instance, of the Irish community in London, which would be different from the representations given by the media at that time. And we can't forget there were times when the Irish community was often portrayed as supporting terrorists in the conflict in Northern Ireland. And then in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was much more this idea of community artists and cultural activists working together with the government, often after riots, like the riots that happened in Brixton, where Leah lives in South London, or in parts of Liverpool or Birmingham, to rebuild shattered neighborhoods, to create new community cohesion, also through community arts work. More recently, there was the idea of the city as a school. So, for example, through the pedagogical work of activists, including the mayor of Bogota, for instance, Antanas Mokus, the use of performative actions of different types to try to change people's behavior, also by nudging people to change their behavior. Mokus himself dressing up as a superhero in the streets of Bogota with a big C on his chest, super citizen or super ciudadano, showing people that it was wrong to shoot beggars or homeless people, that it was important to also respect people in traffic, to control road rage, to reduce other forms of antisocial behavior. And these strategies have been used really throughout also Europe. They have been very common, an important part of the cultural strategies of the new Labour governments under Tony Blair, especially from 1997 to 2007. And then more recently, autonomous cultural activist actions prefiguring alternative futures, starting especially after the crash of 2007-2008, focusing often on this post-capitalist idea of the commons that you've already talked about in this conference, and gaining momentum after the Occupy movement in 2011. So there are many different types of responses. That doesn't solve the issue, though, of what we do now in relation to this particular political crisis. A political crisis which, in terms of the cultural politics and policies of these new nationalistic, especially right-wing populist governments and movements, is focusing often on heritage with an issue of re-traditionalization, reintroducing tradition, reinventing also often tradition. Also often fairly brutal cultural tourism strategies with further commodification and branding. Strategies like the suicidal strategy in Venice to allow big cruise ships to come very close to the Canal Grande and the monuments of the city by the right-wing mayor of Venice. Strategies which often deny multiculturalism and dissonant heritage, like the recent law proposal in Poland to make it a criminal offense to accuse anybody in Poland to have collaborated with Nazism and with the Holocaust, for instance, or to accuse the Polish state of having collaborated with that. A worrying reduction of the role of culture in public policy in many countries, despite the debate on cultural planning and similar debates. A marginalization of the arts in the school curriculum in favor of maths and technology. This has already been mentioned earlier in this lab, the adoption of STEM policies rather than STEAM. Even in countries in Scandinavia, in part, where there is a really proud tradition of a strong role of the arts in creative learning in the school curriculum. So we have an issue of weakening of the links between cultural identity and places, so an issue of deterritorialization. So the question is, how do you counteract that? You can do it through fear, violence and hate, in a way, through a denial of cultural pluralism and biodiversity. And it's interesting that often the people who don't like cultural pluralism also have got problems with biodiversity. Not only Trump, but again, we can see it in the the current debates in Poland about the destruction of the Białowieża National Forest, National Park, is one example. So how can one develop more progressive forms of re-territorialization through cultural action and through cultural exchange is an interesting question, perhaps. There are some interesting responses already. We got some interesting critical elements in the cultural program of European Capitals of Culture, aspects of Liverpool 2008, but mainly Linz 2009, with an interesting project on the Third Reich legacy, Hitler and the old legacy of Hitler for Linz. He was born not far from Linz, and they organized an interesting conference, an exhibition on the monuments that Hitler wanted to build in Linz, something that had not been discussed really properly in the city until the European Capital of Culture program. Or the Atelier de la Méditerranée project in Marseille for European Capital of Culture 2013. Marseille is a city with right-wing local government that has a very difficult relationship with its North African immigrants, many of whom now, of course, born in Marseille, living mainly in the northern quarters of the city and increasingly displaced from the central areas. Or the project In Dialogue in Donostia San Sebastian, European Capital of Culture 2016, exploring the whole issue of the Basque conflict and learning also from artists and cultural activists working in other parts of Europe which have suffered from conflicts like Northern Ireland, Cyprus, and others. The growth of festivals of ideas across Europe is another interesting phenomenon. Book festivals, economics festivals, new media festivals, journalism festivals, which are really developing local high-quality spheres of debate, often as a response to the decline of quality in public service broadcasting. And the emergence of transnational festivals like Trans-Europa, which is exploring in a critical way European alternatives, different forms of European integration, often being financed partly by the EU, but also being critical of the European Union. But how do we respond, to go back to the initial question, to the political crisis that I outlined earlier? Is bottom-up collaborative cultural planning based on the detailed analysis of local cultural resources a response in itself as the opposite of these populist simplifications that I mentioned earlier? Can we create dialogue through actually an intervention through hedonism and fun, perhaps developing cultural policies which are more inclusive, which include more the ways in which people are actually having fun today in cities? So in a way, after all, we are supposed to be specialists in this, people working in the cultural sector, and that's possibly a good way of establishing a dialogue with people who perhaps don't want to talk to us. Can critical listening, empathy, of course, mediation, conciliation, trying to produce a creative synthesis between these different so-called tribes, can it be a solution? Do we have to learn from people who have done cultural projects in situations of conflict? I mentioned earlier Belfast or San Sebastian or Nicosia, for example. Can we accelerate generational change by redistributing power to young people much faster? Young people who, by the way, my impression is, know much more about creativity, how creativity is changing than I do, certainly. Therefore, we should perhaps empower young people much more in defining cultural policies across Europe today. What about the option of resistance, self-protection, and guerrilla actions? What about even trying to reclaim the idea of patriotism? A kind of different patriotism which is not nostalgic, is not protectionist, is not exclusionary, but is more internationally oriented, cosmopolitan, but locally rooted at the same time. Lots of artists, according to, for example, the Good Practice Guide recently produced by the Council of Europe for its Intercultural Cities project, are already doing very interesting work in counteracting fake news and counteracting prejudice at city level. So that's perhaps another possible response. Do we rediscover the idea of popular education? That was at the center, used to be at the center of cultural policy in France, for instance, in the 1950s, early 1960s, in Brazil, in recent years, often linked with participatory budgeting projects. Do we need a new popular education project? A new politics of representation for today, not defined as in the early 1980s, as I mentioned earlier. Do we encourage, again, mass cultural participation through high-quality cultural work? The experience of our work on HAL UK City of Culture 2017 and the evaluation we have recently produced of this seem to suggest that this is important. For instance, if we look at some of the evaluation data, we find that there was around 95% of local citizens engaged in at least one cultural activity in the year in HAL. There was a 9% increase in confidence of residents to take part in different kinds of activities. The project reached something like 56,000 children and young people, which is significant for a city of 260,000. And there was a 34% reported improvement in self-esteem among children and young people. Particularly big impacts in terms of, again, confidence, reduction of loneliness, and improvements in self-esteem for the volunteers. There were 2,400 volunteers, around 1% of the population of the city. That was, that really produced a significant impact in relation to volunteers. One lesson from this HAL experience is confirming also the research by colleagues like Leila Jankovic at the University of Leeds, is that there is no necessary trade-off between mass participation in cultural activities and cultural risk-taking, cultural innovation. So what the project in HAL seemed to prove was that people are remarkably, even people who have not really attended many arts events in the past, are remarkably open to innovation, cultural innovation, to difficult art, provided that it is of high quality. But the question remains, we don't really know this, because there are, as far as I know, very few studies, or perhaps no studies on this. Does this kind of mass cultural participation change political values? We don't know. But we got some evidence, as shown earlier, that it does stimulate optimism and hope, reduces loneliness, and perhaps it also encourages people to study, to think about the option of undertaking further study and to think about complexity, complex ideas. So we need, I think, to rediscover the idea of project, which the etymological origin of the word project is to throw something beyond. So beyond, of course, what you know already. So it's related to this idea of adventure and discovery, and definitely also with rejection of fear. So cultural planning as a project is, to remind you of something we have already talked about in the past, is a cultured project. Shouldn't be ashamed of being cultured. It is about knowing about the cultural detail, the history of cultural representations, the cultural achievements of a place, including achievements that have been forgotten now. It is collaborative, of course, as a project. It is critical, looking also at areas of conflict and contradictions, and it is innovation-oriented. And Chris Murray, who has recently produced with Charles Landry an interesting book on the psychology of cities, wrote a book in 2001 on a cultural planning approach to place marketing, which embodies this collaborative logic, in this book he takes issue against the guru of place marketing, the American, or rather US scholar Philip Kotler, who argues that the task of city marketing is to design and sell place identities. Murray, in the book in 2001, Making Sense of Place, says that the task is more to reveal and discover the complexity, the multiple layering of place identities, rather than simply to design and sell them, using a methodology, Murray suggests, that is more similar to the work of artists rather than to the work of product marketing specialists. Murray demonstrates his point by doing an analysis of the marketing strategies of 75 different local authorities in the UK. His point is that they are stereotypical, fairly standardized, and don't really work. They are really lacking in imagination. He shows, for instance, that in these 75 strategies, the overwhelming adjective used is friendly, rather than any other adjectives, and the strategies are advocating uniqueness in each place, but without really explaining what constitutes this uniqueness. They're not being specific about uniqueness. And they're also usually presenting a fairly homogeneous picture of places, denying diversity. There are lots of pictures of golf courses with Japanese tourists playing golf, and of shopping malls. Now, of course, this was 2001 work. The profession has moved on. There are some more imaginative strategies now, I am told, in places like New Zealand, for example. But I don't know, because I've never been to New Zealand, so I haven't really checked myself. Another application of cultural planning is to intercultural mediation. And interculturalism, intercultural exchange is beneficial in many different ways, I think in at least 3 ways. First of all, because we cannot expect the new immigrants into Europe to integrate into institutions that they have had no say in shaping. Therefore, we do need, I would argue, an intercultural process to define the schools of the future, or the museums of the future, the libraries of the future. So we need a process of intercultural exchange to define new public spaces and new institutions, including universities. Secondly, I think intercultural exchange is probably one of the most effective ways of removing, or at least counteracting, racism and xenophobia and other kinds of prejudice. And thirdly, it is one of the sources of innovation in terms of artistic innovation, organizational design innovation, innovation in fashion, gastronomy, many other areas. So it's really important to cultivate cultural literacy, to also understand what are the different terms in different languages, many different languages. Now we are talking of about 200 different languages being spoken in cities like London, about 160 in a city like Leicester, where I've lived for about a quarter of a century. So we need to understand what people mean by using a certain word in a certain language to refer to beauty, to public space, to different aspects of a city. So this linguistic richness is one of the richnesses of Europe that we are not really capitalizing upon enough as a cultural resource. And also we need to work much more with intercultural actors who continue to be marginalized in urban strategies. They are often young people, and they are often kept in a subordinate position by community leaders who are still emphasizing the separateness of different ethnic communities, certainly in countries like the UK, possibly also in Canada. The Council of Europe, as I said, has produced this Intercultural Cities Research Project, which has also a guide of good practice that I find very useful. Also useful is the Intercultural City book by Phil Wood and Charles Landry. So, again, developing this theme of stimulating intercultural exchange, there are many opportunities also in relation to public art and architecture. There is it continues to surprise me how cities with a very multi-ethnic population are not experimenting more in developing distinctive forms of public art, architecture, and urban design, and instead are reproducing standardized models which do not reflect actually the social fabric of the city. There is some gesture, some recognition of this ethnic and cultural diversity, but it's often limited only to religious buildings or buildings in the suburbs, not in the city centre. There are also big opportunities to counteract ethnic stigmatization through very localized place marketing strategies, so neighborhood-based place marketing, which would stress the cultural richness of places rather than constantly stressing the negatives like problems around criminality, for example. And there is the opportunity to develop new intercultural festivals, new civic events, which embody the changing face, changing reality of cities. Festivals like the Zinneke Parade in Brussels, for example, or the new procession organized for the Manchester International Festival. So, to finish, some possible cultural planning actions. So I think there is a lot more to do to link culture in imaginative ways with the property development industry and with urban renewal. That could be an important new source of funding for cultural activities in Europe. This is much more recognized in North America than in Europe, but I find that in European countries, the cultural sector is not receiving its fair share of resources from property developers. It has an important role in increasing the value of land and property in certain areas, in regenerating areas through the so-called cultural quarters approach. But often arts organizations are not benefiting from this. In fact, they are often victims in the sense that one of the things that usually happens in cultural quarters is a displacement of artistic activities without any benefits being accrued to the cultural sector itself. So it is time to begin to negotiate, to try to create funds which are then under the control of the cultural sector to then redistribute resources for funding cultural activities. It is also important, I think, increasingly in a climate of declining resources at local and national level to develop international urban and regional cultural strategies based on a mapping of the existing and potential cultural links that diasporic communities have in cities today, as well as links by the private sector, by universities, and by the cultural sector itself. And these strategies are beginning to be developed, but often without good cultural mapping underpinning them. It's also important to try to bring the worlds of creativity and innovation together. There are places like Hull itself, where I live now, with a lot of creativity but not enough innovation. And often the two terms, creativity and innovation, are used interchangeably, but we have to recognize that they are very different, that creativity is a divergent process of thinking which generates new ideas, but innovation is often the opposite. It is a convergent process which concerns the issue of selection, of management. It concerns financial and organizational skills, and often creative people are not good at innovation. I regard myself, for example, more on the creativity side than on the innovation side. I need to work with people who can somehow exploit the ideas that I generate, because otherwise they get certainly often dissipated. Therefore, it's important to bring the two together and to recognize the differences also. Creating new political alliances is important. Maybe a dialogue with environmentalists. Perhaps a dialogue also with some of these new political formations that I mentioned earlier. Not all of them are right-wing. It is interesting to talk to some of the left-wing, with some of the left-wing populist movements which are emerging in Europe at the moment. Inventing new forms of advocacy. So, for instance, in Hull, we have produced this rather big report, which is a preliminary outcomes evaluation about the UK City of Culture, produced in only 2.5 months after the end of the project. But the question is now, what do we do with it? I mean, if we just have a seminar for experts, it's likely to have very marginal impact. It is likely that very few people will read this report. So how do we communicate this to people? Do we ask a celebrity to talk about it? Do we ask a philosopher or an artist to visualize this report somehow? So we need to think as hard about communication as we do about actually doing the evaluation itself. Otherwise, there's no point. It is ironic that the country in Europe, which is the UK, which probably has the most sophisticated social and economic impact studies, it is also the country with the most severe cuts in expenditure on the arts. So there is something wrong there. And the other thing, my final recommendation, is that we have to continue to be a stimulus, but also a nuisance. So it is very important, I think, for cultural planners and cultural activists to continue to challenge established thinking in different areas. So, for instance, I remember the number of times I have made speeches to different professional associations about cultural planning, and there's always somebody in the audience raising their hand and saying, "Excuse me, but are you a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute?" And I say, "No, I'm sorry, I've never studied town planning." But, or, "Are you a member of the Chartered Institute of Marketing?" "No, sorry." But nevertheless, I mean, even if we are not members of these institutions, I think we have a right to say what we think, because, of course, we are citizens, we walk through our cities, and we are creative, and often the problem of the established professions is that they do not see the possibilities precisely because of rigid professional categorization and because of a kind of training which, in my view, is not generalist enough. Okay, so finished. Thanks very much. Yes, there is a website where you can download this report if anybody is interested.
Well, that was. Are we on? Okay. Well, that really lifted us up above the clouds and gave us an overview, which is really exciting, but also incredibly worrying. Because it's not a dystopian view, perhaps, but you are sketching out an incredibly complex, you might say, reality, and a lot of issues which have to be addressed. But you also clearly point out you might say, the responsibility of the cultural sector to actually engage or re-engage and find new ways of doing that. You're also redefining you might say, the slogan we have, cultural planning, to say it's not so much about cultural planning, but it is about reconnecting culture with society, whether that society is translated in political terms, whether it's in urban terms, or whether it's in social terms, or whether it's in innovation terms and learning in new ways. We have to redefine and reconnect, and we have to find ways of doing this. And you don't expect that will be given to us, of course, because we are seen, as you say, we're not seen as part of the solution, we're seen as part of the problem. Because there is an increasing gap between, you might say, sectors of the elitist, whether there are artists, whether there are intellectuals, whether there are media and so on, and we are being dispossessed of the right, of the accessibility, the access to, and the perhaps also the language of being able to nudge or affect the community in a positive way. So in a way, it's a far greater radical or call to be more radical. Not that radical necessarily means oppositional, but it means really to try to think new ways of organizing, reorganizing, acting and engaging, and at the same time keeping some of the values which are really at the core of, you might say, European societies, but also citizens which are based on the idea of citizenship. I mean, the ideas of actually being a pluralist, being active, engaging, responsible societies. So that is, of course, a huge onus or weight or responsibility, you know, you're pushing out. But I think that's very good that you do that. And I think it's also probably what you're saying is that, you know, or I'm interpreting it, let's put it this way, I'm interpreting it in my position as can you turn this up, because I'm having to really shout into this mic, and can you turn it up a bit? Okay, I can lower the position is that we have to be very tactical about where we are investing our resources and our time and our creativity and energy, and investing them in situations which are still, you might say, controllable, manageable, but at the same time trying to also change the common picture. It's in some ways there are, and you're also flagging up that there are perhaps wasted opportunities. I mean, something which is very close to my work, or has been for many years, is this Cultural Capital of Europe, and you mentioned Hull in 2017, and I would mention Aarhus 2017, which was Cultural Capital of Europe, and I actually spent 5 years preparing that, 5 years trying to advocate a cultural planning methodology, which involved doing workshops with, among others, 17,000 people. So it's probably been the most meticulously culturally planned social project of the last many decades. And I was, you might say, aborted, or whatever you would call it, from that project a few years ago, and it's not quite sure how that will affect. But one thing you can say, which you flag up, is actually that people are enormously responsive and enormously positive to be included in something which is not political, but cultural, not generic, but particular, and not passive, but active, and not on the basis of selection, but by own participation. It really is clear that if you generate projects which can also happen over a number of years, which have a clear mandate, and a clear territory, which can be spatial, which can be power-wise, but territory, there can be done an awful lot of change. Change can happen. So this idea of actually, you might say, how to change communities from within instigated by cultural processes actually does work. You say we haven't been able to show the results of many of these processes, and I think that's absolutely true. We haven't. Most of them happen on the side, are relatively invisible, are relatively short-lived, are relatively local. So I think what you have done, for example, in Canada has been very good, is actually documenting, is actually communicating, is actually creating this, you might say, wave of interest and understanding. That was also very clear when we talked about the panel who met this afternoon. Although there was a lot of good intentions and understanding and wish, it was a very, I would say, passive panel, and a panel which was also actually did not have the answers not just to what we should do, what one should do, but how actually to even lever situations that might create new positions. And this was to me very worrying, because normally people who are, and we're talking about 6 major gatekeepers. They are gatekeepers. They are door openers. They were very reluctant to, I mean, on a personal level, very positive and very open, but on an institutional level, you could feel that there was a reluctance, a worry about this doesn't fit into the major things. So this is also something which I think is really worrying, and you overemphasize some of these things in your speech about actually how these institutions, the political reality, and so on, actually makes it very difficult to get through with very simple and very progressive and very positive proposals. The most open, though, was, I thought, and he thought, I'm just trying to link things a bit, was the guy from the Arts Equal. And for me, that was really an amazing eye-opener, because he was really... are you here still? All the baddies are here, maybe. Anyway, so he was really very open as to how that should be done and could be done. But the interesting thing was, he was from a foundation which was probably not a permanent institution. It was a project, and he was far freer in his language and his strategic point of view than perhaps people who were representing permanent political structures. So in this situation, the title of the, going back to the title of your speech, was in a way to say, in a way, we are not perhaps saying that we have to be activist, but perhaps the solutions are not within the system, are perhaps not within the construction of the, you might say, the normalized processes which we have always relied on to deliver the best solutions for our communities, for our cities, for our neighborhoods, for whatever, for our cultural institutions. Perhaps the answers are not in there. I don't know, open question. Perhaps we have to find some other kind of collaborations with another kind of forums and other kind of situations in which cities or city organizations or departments or whatever can be a partner, but we cannot expect them to open the doors, change their policies, and actually, you might say, do what we're asking them to do. So in a way, and looking and listening to some of the talks we've had, I was in a wonderful session just before we came in here, which was the Altamu, which was from Kiel, and which was also Free Riga, in which they were flagging up, I think several people were here, flagging up that they had to find new financial situations for actually realizing the dreams that they had. So, I mean, those kind of, which was quite a radical, anyway, challenging task. So it was really, if you'd have given this speech 10 years ago, 10 years ago, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about that. Just after the crisis around that, I think you would have come up with a far more positive, far more belief in the public system, far more, you might say, rational solution, and far more about step 1, step 2, step 3. But the way you are presenting it, and the reality is it, they are, the things you present at the end, they are sporadic, they are hopeful, they are suggestions. There is no overall philosophical, overall political, because we are in a time which is conflictual, completely changing, and we don't know which door to go in and out of and who to collaborate with. So in a way, it is an interesting, it's a fascinating situation to be in. But it's very worrying. All right, that didn't really sort out anything, did it? Apart from complicate matters even more. But in a way, I just think that it is really so. So Franco's not got the answer, and I don't have the answers, and you guys, you've got the answers. So where are the next steps? I mean, we've heard a lot of the examples. We've invited you in to talk in your workshops. There are a lot of good examples. There are lots of passionate people. There are lots of positive cultural institutions. There are lots of local organisations who want to do things. But where's the step forward? Where's the first step, the second step? You're playing in on that. Good. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lena Hayek. I see a lot of parallels here from the world of commercial business design. I experience the same things with corporates, which to me is like the parallel of the institutions, cultural institutions. And I'm wondering, or perhaps forecasting, would there something be parallel to the design and tech, where there would be hackers, cultural hackers, the equivalent of startup culture, but for the creative industries? I'm thinking of, we talk about collaboration. What about open source? Do we have any kind of open source stuff? Really bring stuff to the people and perhaps use the models of what has already been illustrated to us from the design and tech world and just transfer it to this. Because this is, everyone here is really people-centered, people-led. And then you have people from the, design world. I'm a UX designer, and it's all about people. So, we can plug in resources, as you mentioned, using alliances. So those are my thoughts and ways that we could potentially move forward.
Some more comments? More yes, Leah? Yes?
One quick thought. Thinking aloud. So it's also the age of cities, isn't it, now? If we can agree with that. So there seems to be a resurgence of cities. And along with that, there seems to be a resurgence of localism. We put an ism in that, localism. But I would say, what if we thought of cities as our project? So the city as a project, the city in the making, the local government as the kind of mechanism. Depending on how we get to the local government, of course, it's, again, democratic participation, transversal groups joining into local government. But it's we need to bring this discussion down, because cultural planning was born out of the big state crisis of resources and the funding, etc., the post-industrial and all the rest of it. So now we are living in a fragmented urban world, economic world, social world, etc. So I guess if we don't start from situating this debate somewhere in space also, whether it's regions or cities, we cannot start coming to, we can't grapple with this. So I suggest we think of cities and places like a project. And then we start thinking of how do we apply culture. Culture is not non-political. Culture is very political. So then we have another argument there, who participates, who not, etc. How do we go? I think it's a question of local democracy. How do we act on that?
Okay.
What kind of strategies, development processes, etc.
Okay, so we have this idea of, you might say, another attitudes, open up, direct participation, direct models, using new media, using new, and we have this idea of local democracy and place. Place, we have to have a geographic, you might say, unit, and that's very much what Mauna was talking about. We have to say it has to be rooted, otherwise it's, you mentioned in one of the workshops, too diffuse, too conflictual, too many things, too many agendas. Place is what we have, and place is where we start. So do you want to comment on that? Is anything there that resonates, or
not for the time being? Thanks.
Okay.
But it's also a question of politicizing place, because you can't. The danger is the entropy of place. The danger is not in my backyard. The danger is, I'm not thinking about the city next door. La di da. So it's politicizing that culture of the place, really, and aiming for justice, equality, aiming for the serious kind of values of the Enlightenment, not forgetting about that. in this kind of la-di-da, postmodernist, anything goes attitude, etc. So there's 2 or 3 things. Localism, again, rethinking localism in a more enlightened way, in a more positive way, by getting straight to the question, radicalizing culture for, in a positive way, bringing that debate out.
Okay, good. Does anyone want to lead on from there or comment? Yes?
Sorry, going back to the comment.
Yeah, turn on your mic.
Just going back to the comment about innovation and open source. So in Hamilton, we're doing a social innovation lab called City Lab Hamilton, and we're doing co-creation. It's actually with students from Mac, Mohawk, Redeemer, the 3 post-secondary institutions, and we embed the 4 pillars, including culture. And so far, it's still very early. They just launched in November. There's been a few instances of them using our open data, and we have been trying our mapping solution. We didn't get funding, so our mapping solution is to put our key assets in open data, and they pulled our assets into tourism apps, which were very creative and like way different than what staff would ever do. And so, and these are like bite-sized, small projects, right? Very experimental, but it is youth. It is using open source and mapping. I'm not saying it's a solution. I'm saying maybe a social innovation lab or incubators like that could open the door to new ideas.
Yeah, Eva?
Yeah, I'm also actually really buying into this idea of open source, and if we're talking about activism and kind of localism, globalism, it's surely somehow also not place-based anymore, where you can be active about a topic just kind of wherever you are, or and then at the same time, of course, you have some kind of local activism, but then you actually have to divide these, what was it, like somewheres and anywheres? So this is now colliding when we talk local, because we are the ones kind of metropolitans, and now we're here sitting and talking about these people that are rooted in somewhere. So open source for me is definitely something that should be more taken in consideration in the future, because here we can only generate like inspiration and tools, but it has to come from someone else. We can't be here generating like a system how we are going to do it, because we're going to travel away, we're going to migrate all the time. So it's just, we need to produce something that inspires people in the place. Yeah, and then we can, yeah, I don't know, that's like an open-ended thinking.
Okay, I'm going to ask Jana, who's, when you hear this, and when you think of your role in Pori as to how you can use culture, how you can support culture, and how it is important for the city, and I know you really believe in that and do that, and are, in a way, one of the best examples. But when you listen to the agendas and you might say the scenario of how the world is, and you try and look at that, how would you then see if you could move forward, if you could take a step which would, you might say, address some of these issues from your point of view, and you don't have to think about political mandate, you don't have to think about finances so much, but actually what you could imagine in your city as to something which would really change. What would it be, given what we've talked about of the examples of the methods and so on?
Actually, just this day and the panel you were so unhappy about was an eye-opener for me, in that sense that your comment about the where the cultural planning should happen, and we shouldn't think about the borders of the municipalities. Pori is the capital of Satakunda region, and in our city we always have to kind of think about the region, but still our politicians say Pori first. And as a city official, I still always have in my mind the Pori region and the Satakunda region, and you empowered me again to work for not only for the limits of Pori city, but my thought of working broader is actually very good. And also, thank you, Franco. We are of the same age, so we share a lot of things. So we never met before. So yeah, but I felt immediately. I felt immediately that you are truly talking to me, and yes, that's important, and that's important. So very empowering, and also giving me new tools. Because when you work in the city, you are in the between the citizens, and you are there between the departments, and you have the politicians, and you have the lady mayor. We have a lady mayor, so you're there in between, and you need to be empowered. But this seminar again is going to open my mouth in a different way in my city.
Okay.
So this kind of thing is needed.
And I know you're opening your mouth a lot, so that's good, actually. So that's very good.
But not actually, Trevor,
no.
not in my city. And now I really need to do that.
But yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, I know. I was unhappy. Yeah, I know. I played the unhappy person, but actually I was just trying to be critical in a maybe stupid way. Sorry, but
it's okay.
It's okay. You understand?
And that's Kai, who was so good.
I have my weaknesses as well.
Yeah. Kai, who was so good. He is actually permanently working for the Theatre Academy of Finland. So he has his background there as well.
Yes. Okay. Good. Birgitta, you wanted to say something? Yeah.
My name is Erika Manson, and I was
into the mic.
I was one of the persons that took the initiative to start the Swedish network for culture planning 10 years ago, and what I'm thinking and feeling now when I sit here and hear your lecture is. The culture planning process are not to be into a local authority at all, and we have to create totally new corporations, maybe based on open source, as some of you said before here, and we have to put a lot of effort of creating new partnership. I don't believe in the bureaucracy anymore. I have been a leader in cultural institutions and local authorities for 25 years and tried all the time to have different kind of strategies and different kind of partnerships and so on, and we made some results, but it's in this context that you described, and we all feel that context very into the skin every day. I feel we have to do something else. We have to cooperate with the local authorities, but we have to bring in other elements, other methods, activism, and be a lot more brave and not so nice anymore, like we said the other day.
Okay, now there are several people starting to get it. I think it was Peter, then Yekaterina, and then it was somebody over there. I don't know. Then your name is... Let's see afterwards. And then, so we take those. Yeah, Christian, after that.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a very important session in a way, because very important questions are put on the table, and thank you for that. And I very much agree with Leah when she talks about the focus on the municipality level, because I think that's really where the life is concrete and where we can make new frames for developing some movements in a way. And I think also we need to make alliance and work together with unions and think about that, because that's really also the working class are present there. There's the housing movement.
You mean trades movement?
Sorry?
Unions. What do you think? What do you think?
Labor unions.
Labor unions. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
because I think we have to break out of these cultural circles in a way because they're too narrow. And you have the housing issues, which is popping up everywhere. You have the ecology and the environmental movements, and so that there's a lot of places where you can be useful in a way. So I think it's also to change the approach to be useful for some organized locations and people and neighborhood assemblies and what it could be, instead of trying to make project for them or with them because we need some funding to survive or something. It's that's a change of the perspective, and I can see in Europe there are many cities now where actually things are changing very radically, and they have the mayor in several cities in Spain, and Coruña, Barcelona, and Madrid, and so on. So it's not. I think it's important not to be too depressed. Actually.
Good. Okay. Good. Yekaterina?
For me, the question of competing dictionaries, vocabularies, and discourses, because one of the questions which was raised yesterday, it was about cultural planning versus cultural strategy. So even between us, we, our vocabulary is competing, but also what was presented in this brilliant lecture, it was also about competing vocabularies and how to establish another vocabulary than these which are not satisfying for us. And also we were speaking with other colleagues here during the lecture, during the conference, and there was a nice remark from my Polish colleague who was saying that, okay, we're speaking of innovation, but we innovative people never use innovation. We use it only behind the bureaucrats, It's not the word which actually describes what we are doing in our lives. So it's really, the problem is that we are under the vocabularies which are not produced by us, and how to establish this vocabulary. So this is one of main questions, I think.
Okay, interesting, yeah. So that we're going over to there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Essi Lindberg. I work in the youth housing, social youth housing sector as an inclusion expert and a service designer. And I think the role of authorities, the future role at least, should be kind of a facilitator of good life of the people living in the cities, in the communities, and they should work with people who are in contact with those marginalized people, excluded people, as we are working with these unemployed, sometimes unemployed, and people without housing, somehow marginalized people, and we are like trying to help them to dream and trying to give them to voice and give their possibility to interact. So actually, authorities should interact with us. So and also artists, in a way, can cooperate with us and be in the middle of us and the authorities.
Okay, I think we're going to have to round it up soon. So I'm going to take Christian, and then you have a little intervention, and then I think we'll ask Franco just to sort of reflect maybe on some of the points that have been made, or to give us some hope back again and say I was far too defeatist and negative, and we go to have a drink. So we'll do that. So Christian?
Thank you, Christian from Urgent Agency. I'm also really happy for the discussion as such. And it's really kind of bringing a sense of urgency to the whole, not to be too obvious here. But I think there's an interesting kind of feeling about suddenly it's real, right? It's not fun anymore. It's not just like a funky streetscape. It's like serious. And also personal in a way that it hasn't been until recently, which is quite also scary. But I agree with Peter, let's not be too pessimistic about it either. I do think, though, that since I fell in love with cultural planning and this whole scene that also you've been creating, Trevor, I feel that we kind of forget the commercial sector. So that's my problem here. Is there anybody here from the private sector? A single person? From the private sector? How many from the private sector here? So maybe 10, maybe. So, but it's not. It's just like I have a feeling that we underestimate the power of private sector. So private sector, it's people like everybody, nice people, most of them, and I feel we kind of underestimate like the machinery of the world is money. So we need to. I think we need to try to include the developers, the business. The business is much more in this conversation, and I think that. I think they would understand in a sense, like also with this kind of urgency. So I think it's really about trying to convey to the people who are outside this discourse what it can bring to the table. And as you say, Franco, maybe do it in a fun way, show the power of what great culture events and artistic endeavors can produce.
Good, okay, thanks. Yeah, awesome.
I'd like to build on that also. I agree with you, Christian. I'm also Christian from Dietrich. That of course it's very interesting to work with for instance, the developers, and we try to do that. And I agree, but to a certain extent also, because in the end there is the bottom line that comes out of it. So to a certain extent they're also willing to engage in these kind of activities. But what I want to return to a little bit, and maybe just open question, and maybe it's also a bit dystopian, is. The fact that I would say this kind of developer-oriented city development that we see, a very close link between not even politicians or elected people or representatives. I mean, like certain civil servants in the sales and tender departments are very well linked with a quite few number of big development companies, and that's the people we see create the arena and the forum of how our cities look today. So some solutions in that direction would be really good to insist somehow in transparency in some of these processes, and to take that process actually back to a more open forum where more people are included in that real process that's going on right now.
Okay. What?
Actually, my comment is about the panel again, because I was thinking about it.
I really did make a mistake there, didn't I? I really did step into it, didn't I? Yeah.
The thing is, what you witnessed actually was a piece of history, because this was a reunion of people who now have decided that cultural planning is, or the different ways of cultural planning is something that we are going to use.
Okay. We'll edit the video. We will take that out of the video. They will never know. We make a pact. Nobody will ever tell them.
Well,
okay.
We told them.
This is complete theatre. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
So you can just say that I'm a bit like that. I'm a bit manic, and it's my pills that were not taken at the right time.
Trevor, shut up. It was a big moment for Finland. Thank you.
No. Okay. So. No more. Oh, you always come at the last moment, don't you?
But I have to say something about another panel, much better panel, no, more positive panel, I don't know. I just wanted to comment on what Christian brought up, because the private sector is really important, and we see that in Norway. And because when we start talking about cultural planning and just using the term cultural, and that's what we got into in the panel yesterday. Was it yesterday or the day before? Yeah. It's about the need to discuss what lies within cultural planning. Can we just sort of talk about the tools and the methods and put those into planning? Because as soon as we get into the matter and start talking about what it actually is, they're not that scared. But when you come with cultural, they're just like shutting the doors. So that's like an interesting question, because it's not just public and people, it's also private.
Yep. Okay. Now people want to talk anyway. This is generator. You think you want to say something? Is it your?
Yeah. I will try to be very quick.
That's all right.
And yeah, from our experience, we have realized that actually the system is constantly changing, and by changing things, there appear some failures, some loose areas, and we have to be smart enough to use these loose areas, and like we have decided to grab these empty buildings and to become visible, and so that all these good ideas doesn't stay just in these four walls, but they go out and to bring out these ideas, we have to learn to use these loose areas of system.
I think that's a very pragmatic but very honest way of looking at things, that we have to use the opportunities we have, but we have to take the opportunities and we have to grasp them, and we have to be able to know exactly what to do with them when they arise. It's not about strategic planning, it's not about this, but it's the opportunities which are there and turn up every time, and we just have to be very good to adapt, to be able to, you might say, engage with the right things at the right time. I think that's a very good sense, whichever position we are in and wherever we're doing things. So that's really very good. They keep on. I'm going to close it now and try and make a soft landing before we go into something which is even maybe deeper and more problematic. But there was one, who disappeared? Or we just moved seat? You've moved seat, you must say. Okay.
Yeah, I tried to be brief also.
But you're going to conclude.
I conclude.
Good.
I actually conclude.
Good.
I conclude with a word. As one of the few people that raised hand with private, I think one of there was a lot of talk about the wordings. I think it's good to shift maybe mindset from the private sector, so-called, and to think more about entrepreneurial. Because it's a funny thing that even though it is a sector, it's actually a very diverse area. And for me, working with the suburbs and being an entrepreneur myself, I think one of the most eye-opening ways of approaching things that what we have talked about today, and indeed these political challenges that we are facing, I have learned from small entrepreneurs who are actually creating something very locally. If they're immigrants, obviously having a very different outlook, and I would inspire everybody to get to know entrepreneurs. It's fantastic because it's really a really special strategy in these times that we are living.
Okay.
That's my take.
Cultural planning becomes cultural entrepreneurship. We're on. Okay, good. Okay, you're back again? You weren't satisfied?
Yeah, just want to continue a little bit. So, and the ideology of behind these entrepreneurs, these new startup people, is design thinking. And actually, I've been listening this conversation during 2 days, and I've collected these words: values, nudging, engaging, active, sustainable, diverging, converging, co-creation, open data, big data. They all used in service design scene. And there's a lot of good books, a lot of good tools, like a lot of things. Go and read them, because they have been selling this design thinking, service dominant logic into business in companies.
Yeah.
There is not all management level people agree with them, but they have sold that already. So maybe we can learn something from them.
Yeah, I think I'll sign up to a new BA course in innovation. So I think that's true. Maybe we've been reading the wrong books. Maybe we've been reading the wrong books. Okay, so what you're hearing actually is that you've distanced, you might say, this comfortable, rational, very positive group who were thinking we had solutions and we could just work on doing nice little models about you do step 1, step 2, and challenged it completely. And that's via my mismediation has created a vacuum and a doubt. But cultural planning is we all obviously have believed in it. We're all doing it in some way or another, on some level, and the principles have not changed, but the reality has changed. As what you're putting it, the reality has changed. So we either take a giant step, or we get in the back door, or we start building bridges. We need another way to get there to address this thing you're talking about. Has anything we've said now, the last half an hour, changed anything in your presentation, or give it or give it you You can use that. Yeah. You do that.
Sorry. No, I mean, I've heard, for example, the issue in relation to the private sector is really interesting. I think we need cultural activism to explain to people how the capitalism works in cities today in Europe. So, because I think in a way there is an increasing coexistence between what we could call more kind of clean capitalism that is often made of small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, and actually a corrupt capitalism of different kinds. There are different kinds of corruption. Some of them are not. Some of them are not as extreme as others, and you know, for example, there is clearly a difference between some of the companies like Carillion in Britain, who has recently gone bankrupt and which was not paying its small and medium-sized businesses working for them, and mafia capitalism. There is a difference between the two. I'm not saying it is the same thing, but actually there is a problem, and often the corruption in capitalism is actually damaging the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs. So if cultural projects can be a way of visualizing the way capitalism works in a city, for example, even visualizing who owns the land in a city, who are the owners of the land, and explaining to people how things work. Often people think that the local authority can do everything in a city because it owns everything, but actually this is not the case. So cultural projects which are much more about explaining how the economy works, I think would be supported by a lot of people in the private sector, not by everybody, but we don't want to be supported by everybody, because that links with the other big question that now we are, like it or not, there is a fight, unfortunately. I'm one of the most conflict-avoiding people you can possibly think, and I have virtually no physical courage whatsoever. When the fascists were beating people up in Italy in the late 1970s, I was always the one who ran away. Okay? I've never been beaten up by anybody, except on one occasion, but this was about football, so it's a different story. But anyway. And so, but I think now there is actually an urgency. For example, one of the things that I didn't mention in the talk was that one of the most successful young fascist movement in Italy is called Casa Pound. It is a movement which is adopting all the methodologies of progressive cultural activists. They are occupying buildings, squatting buildings. They are very, very good on social media. They have a profound understanding of fashion. They have got profound understanding of branding, and they are incredibly influential with teenagers. Being fascist is cool among a lot of teenagers in Rome today. Okay, so and the problem people have in dealing with a movement like that is that increasingly there are big constraints on local authorities, on people working in universities, on publicly funded cultural associations to actually be explicitly counterattacking the values of movements like this one. And I find in myself it is very frustrating to be an academic in many ways, because you always have to sit on the fence, especially if you are in a position like the one I am now, where you are running a research institute and you have certain responsibilities of sticking to the corporate policy of the university. You cannot actually say certain things. So this is why we are in a situation of urgency, but an incredibly frustrating situation. I don't really have an answer to this, but I know that I know it is difficult to counteract some of these movements. Then there was the very good points made by Leah that I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm all in favor of, for example, the ideas of Benjamin Barber, the ideas of the Global Parliament of Mayors, the idea that, in a way, the values of cities are what is going to save us, and that the problem is with the nation state, and that the glocal idea, which seems to have gone out of fashion, nobody says it anymore, but the fact that glocalism is probably a good idea, where you have the supranational level in Europe with a reformed EU, hopefully more democratic, and then you have powerful cities and regions, perhaps even, it's a good idea. But the problem is that, unfortunately, the austerity policies have hit cities incredibly hard, and now cities cannot do the kind of things they like. Albert Bohr, the former mayor or leader of Birmingham City Council, has even talked about the death of local government recently. And in some countries, there is clearly a political use of austerity policies to reduce the power of cities as an alternative center of power that can somehow contest the sort of strategies, cultural and economic strategies, that are being implemented by national governments. So while I totally agree with the suggestion, I think we still have a problem, because we don't know how do we deal with this complete lack of power, this reduction of the role of local government. So it's extremely difficult. I agree also with the idea of partnerships, and that's a very good idea, but again, partnerships have to be subjected to some form of democratic accountability, democratic control. These cultural partnerships are emerging throughout the UK, for instance, in England especially, often with universities at the centre playing a really important role, like in Sunderland, for instance. Also in Hull, there is an emerging new cultural partnership. But it seems to me that if you read some of the language of Arts Council England and also of the government, that they are deliberately trying to reduce the role of local authorities in partnerships. And I don't like that, because after all, local authorities are elected bodies, and I think they have more of a link with working class people than certainly we do as a university. So, I mean, I've got some problems. Partnerships is a great idea, but what's the democratic accountability of partnerships? Also, the open source point, again, is really good, and I was involved in, for about 5 years, in the building of this proposal by Matera in the south of Italy for the European Capital of Culture, which is next year in 2019. We used open source, open data for the construction of the proposal, and we created this web platform that was really useful, because it allowed people who were from Matera but had migrated to Berlin, London, all over the world, to contribute ideas to the project, and actually implementing some projects themselves. And it also allowed people who were kind of sympathizing with Matera, who probably, they were not from there, but they had been there once, or they had some sort of emotional connection of one kind or another, to contribute to the construction of the proposal. We also created these residencies for what we call civic hackers. There was a project called Unmonastery, which was the idea of the old monastery, sort of ora et labora, pray and work, which the difference was people were essentially doing things for the local community, and we offered them simply a kind of subsistence wage and free board and lodging for a period of time. And they came from all over the world, really, and they did some really good projects. Where I kind of disagree with some of them, only in their belief of almost like the magical power of this collective intelligence of the internet. There I'm not sure that it works, because I think there is a need for some kind of mediation at local level, actually, by also face-to-face interaction, talking to people. I don't think there is any magical power, as far as I can tell, but I may be wrong, because I'm not really an expert. Now, the problem with this idea of open source is that it needs a lot of long-term commitment, and there is a lot of political fragility behind it, and it's very easy for more traditional forms of operation to reassert themselves, as I think it is happening also in the case of Matera at the moment. So, yeah, so thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Well, that was a sort of marathon session.